So on this day after Valentine's Day, let's start with a few UU Valentines. I love you more than fair trade coffee. Almost. It is one of our sacraments, right? Coffee. We go together like a flame in a chalice. Would these work on any of you? I love you more than Thoreau loved the woods. You could take too long at joys and sorrows, and I'd still listen. You're my soulmate. Of course, I need to explain what I mean by soul in this context. Hey, baby, want to have some just, equal, and compassionate human relations? I have more, but I'll stop there before I get in trouble with the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. So those are funny because they're true, and they're also funny because they're not quite true enough. Because love in real life is less about clever lines, and it's so much more about how we show up for one another when things get hard and awkward and frustrating and so deeply human. And on the back of every order of service, we have this graphic of our UU values and covenant, these 7 values that put the value of love at the center. And the day after Valentine's Day feels like an especially fitting time to pause and ask, what does that really mean to put love at the center? Not the pressure to get romantic love right one night a year, not a sweet sentiment, not a graphic on a page, but love in real life, in our families, in our friendship, in our parenting, in our marriages, in our other intimate relationships, in our just the everyday messiness of ordinary life. As I sat with that question while preparing this sermon, a poem kept returning to me. I wonder how many of you will know this poem. I think it was written in the late 80s. It's not an easy poem, but it is powerful, and I do think it speaks to something important about love in real life. It's called I Go Back to May 1937. It's by Sharon Olds. Does anybody know this poem? Okay. It goes like this. I see them standing at the formal gates of their colleges. I see my father strolling out under the ochre sandstone arch, the red tiles glinting like bent plates of blood behind his head. I see my mother. I see my mother with a few light books at her hip, standing at that pillar made of tiny bricks. The wrought iron gate still open behind her, its sword tips aglow in the May air. They are about to graduate. They are about to get married. They are kids. They are dumb. All they know is they are innocent and they would never hurt anybody. I want to go to them and say, stop. Don't do it. She is the wrong woman, and he is the wrong man. You are going to do things you cannot imagine that you would ever do. You're going to do bad things to children. You are going to suffer in ways you have not heard of. And I want to go up to them in that late May sunlight and say it. Her hungry, pretty face turning to me, her beautiful, pitiful, untouched body, his arrogant, handsome face turning to me, his pitiful, beautiful, untouched body. But I don't do it because I want to live. I take them up like male and female paper dolls, and I bang them together at the hips like chips of flint. And as I do strike sparks from them, I say, do what you are going to do, and I will tell about it. That is a long and painful, and at least to me, beautiful in many ways, way of saying something much simpler, something you've heard me quote before. That our families can push our buttons because our families sewed on our buttons. That's not an accusation. It is an explanation. And what Sharon Olds' poem is showing us is this: how we understand and experience and practice love, it doesn't start in adulthood. Love starts in childhood, in the homes we grow up in. Love starts long before we choose a partner, long before we become parents, if we become parents, long before we have any sense of what we're doing. We carry all of that with us into every relationship that we have. So when we talk about love at the center, we're not talking about romance. We're talking about patterns and wounds and habits of reacting, protecting, pleasing, withdrawing, controlling, surviving. None of you have done any of those things, I'm sure. I've never done any of those things. Those things that we learned, that were modeled for us in our earliest years. And then often unconsciously, we bring all of that into our most intimate relationships, our friendships, our families, and we wonder why love can sometimes be so hard. But here's the good news. Today, we have access to more resources than ever before in human history about how to break these all too familiar patterns of harm and trauma that Olds' poem is describing. We are living in a moment when we understand the inner lives of relationships in ways our parents and our grandparents did not and could not. We won't ever be perfect, whatever that would even mean. But we do have more tools than ever before to move toward healing and harm reduction. In an age when so many billionaires, and soon to be Elon Musk is a trillionaire, the financially richest among us seem to think they have all the wealth they need. But I often think about how healers like the holistic psychologist Nicole LaPera talk about a very different kind of wealth, a new generational wealth. New generational wealth, growing up with clear boundaries instead of the physical punishment that broke your spirit and trust. A new generational wealth of a peaceful home where no one has to walk on eggshells and truth can be spoken and everyone is heard. A new generational wealth of unconditional worth, not having to perform, achieve, or caretake to be valued and appreciated. The new generational wealth of hearing, "I'm sorry," and getting a genuine apology from a parent when their behavior is hurtful, or overwhelming. The new generational wealth of witnessing your parents speak respectfully about each other, even if their marriage doesn't make it. Still speaking respectfully about each other. The new generational wealth of having an emotionally mature parent who helps you become a securely attached adult. If you don't know what secure attachment means, you need to read this book. The new generational wealth of having parents, especially fathers, since boys and men are so often taught not to do this, who cry, express their emotions, and comfort you when you express yours. As we tell Jalen, you seem to be having big feelings right now. Gonna make space for that. Not having to keep a dark secret about a family member. I know none of you have ever had to do that. The new generational wealth of parents who can regulate their emotions. As you hear this list, you might notice if one or two of these land a little harder for you than the others. You might feel yourself thinking, "Oh, I had that," or, "Whew, I really didn't have that." Or, "I'm trying to give that to my kids now," or your grandkids, or other children or young people in your life. Pay attention to that, because that inner tug or inner clench that you feel can be gently pointing you to places of what love is calling us to do, and where we may most need support when the timing feels right to begin tending to those places with care. Many of us know from experience that you can have your external life in order and still feel anxious and lonely and reactive and disconnected and perpetually on edge on the inside. That's again one of those sayings, don't judge your insides by other people's outsides, right? Find places where you can safely share your insides. Because the real work was never about what we accumulated. It is about how are we shaped by love and what we now have to unlearn and relearn again and again. What matters is whether our emotional needs were met when we were small, whether we felt safe, whether we felt heard, whether we felt like a burden, whether we felt like we had to perform to be loved. When one or more of those needs weren't met, it doesn't mean that we grew up empty, but it means we grew up adapting. We grew up protecting. We grew up surviving. And then we carried those survival strategies into our adult relationships, and we called it our personality, or our communication style, or just the way I am. What LaPera calls a new generational wealth is awakening to the truth that healing our relationships is not just personal growth. It is cultural work, it's justice work, it's family work. It's how cycles that have run for generations can finally begin to change with you. What this means practically is that change doesn't begin with our partner. It doesn't begin with our family. It begins within as we become increasingly aware of the patterns that we have been running on autopilot. Most of the time, we are not consciously choosing how we show up in relationship. If you are, then good, congratulations, that's what we're going for. Most of us often are unconsciously defaulting to scripts we learned and that were modeled for us in our earliest years. But when we start to notice those scripts, you can be like, oh, that's that script. I'm doing in this argument the same thing that I saw my dad do in this argument, right? You're like, oh, you notice that script, and then it begins to make it workable. So when we begin to see the roles that we learn to play as children, the ways we learn to cope, the habits we built to feel safe, we gain this invaluable new perspective. We gain choice. We begin to realize that we don't have to keep replaying the same dynamics over and over. We don't have to keep reacting to those old wounds as if they are still happening in the same way in the present moment. We can pause. We can get curious. Like, what's really happening? What are all my options right now? And ask, is this reaction actually helping this relationship? Is this pattern who I want to be? And little by little, as we make different choices in ordinary moments, we begin to create a new sense of safety inside ourselves that doesn't depend on other people getting everything right. I'm going to say that again. We begin to create a new sense of safety and security inside ourselves that doesn't depend on other people getting everything right. And over time, those small choices start to feel more natural, more second nature. New ways of responding begin to replace old ones, not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually and steadily. It's a practice. We may still feel the pull of our old habits, the reflex to protect, to withdraw, to control, to please, but now we have access that we didn't have to something we didn't have before, options. And one of the most important keys to having those options is something we don't always talk about enough, learning how to calm and steady our own nervous systems so that we can respond from who we want to be instead of reacting from who we had to be in order to survive our childhoods, our adolescence, whatever. If you're curious to learn more, I do recommend Nicole LaPera's book, How to Be the Love You Seek, Breaking Cycles, Finding Peace, and Heal Your Relationships. She also has a new book coming out next month. I can't tell you whether it's good or not because it's coming out next month. I haven't read it yet. It's called Reparenting the Inner Child, the New Science of Our Oldest Wounds and How to Heal Them. For now, I'll have to limit myself to sharing just one practice for becoming the love you seek. She calls it practicing empowerment consciousness, as opposed to just reacting out unconsciously and rehearsing these old scripts. At its heart, this practice is about learning to just take a step back and witness those stories that we automatically tell ourselves when we feel hurt, ignored, rejected, or threatened in a relationship. As the old saying goes, you do not have to believe everything you think, and you definitely don't have to act or say aloud everything you think. Most of us have a handful of old narratives that get activated the moment something feels off. Stories like, I'm not important, or I'm too much, or I'm not enough, or people always leave, or I have to take care of everything yourself. None of you have ever thought any of those things before, I'm sure. When those stories take over, we don't respond to the person in front of us. We are reacting to ghosts from our past. So the first step is simply noticing when one of these old stories is running the show. The second step is learning to gently question your thoughts. You don't have to believe everything you think. To pause and ask, is this actually what's happening right now? Or is this an old wound trying to interpret the present moment? Maybe your partner hasn't texted back, maybe a friend didn't respond in the way you hoped. Before you spiral into certainty about precisely what this means, when you really don't have the data, we can practice considering other personalities. Brené Brown often suggests a simple shift in language, saying, the story I'm telling myself about this is, do you see how that gives you a little bit of distance? Instead of, this is what's happening. So the story I'm telling myself about this is, it sort of consciously lets you say, there may be other stories too that I might need to weave in. It's a real shift. The third step is learning to care for the part of ourselves that first learned to tell that old story. The younger self who felt unsafe, unseen, unworthy. We remind ourselves, I am no longer that small child in that moment. I have resources now. I have agency now. I can ask for support. And finally, we begin to practice new internal messages, reminders of our worth, our safety, and our capacity to be in relationship without losing ourselves. At first, these reminders may feel awkward and unconvincing. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me, right? Some of you are with me on that. But over time, as we repeat them, we begin to create new pathways in how we think, we feel, and we respond. What all of this does is give us something extraordinary in our relationships. Again, a pause, a choice. The ability to respond from who we want to be instead of reacting from who we had to be in order to survive. And this is where love at the center becomes so much more real. And when we can do all that, when we can pause and choose, and again, respond from who we want to be, that's when all those silly you Valentines we looked at the beginning, they stop being jokes. And suddenly, I love you more than fair trade coffee becomes learning how not to keep score. We go together like a flame in a chalice becomes learning how to hold space for each other without trying to fix each other. You could take too long at joys and sorrows, and I'd listen becomes the daily practice of really listening. And hey, baby, want to have some of that just, equal, and compassionate human relations starts being the work of putting love at the center in real life. Because love at the center, it's not a sentiment, it's a practice. That's why Unitarian Universalism talks about covenant instead of creed, because love isn't something we believe, it's something we practice with one another. Not a Valentine's Day of desperately trying to get it right one night a year, but thousands of ordinary moments, tens of thousands of ordinary moments where we notice our patterns, calm our nervous system, choose our responses, and practice being the kind of person we wish had been there for us when we were younger. As the saying goes, practice doesn't make perfect, but it does make more permanent. Over time, things become more possible, more natural, more a part of who we are. Let's breathe into the power and beauty of that possibility, practicing becoming the sort of person that you wish had been there for you when you were younger. That's that reparenting stuff. All this means Valentine's Day is not just about yesterday. It's about today and tomorrow and the next conversation you have this afternoon, the next time you're feeling your buttons getting pushed, the next time you choose gently and imperfectly and bravely to forgive yourselves and each other and to begin again in love. So however yesterday went for you, whether it was romantic, disappointing, awkward, joyful, lonely, completely forgettable, or whether you ignored it on purpose, I want to wish you a very happy Valentine's Day, but not just once a year, but every day, in the quiet, ordinary ways that we practice love with one another. And I'm grateful to be on that journey with all of you of putting love at the center.
I'll add just one more piece. When I think about love at the center, I also always often think about the Cornel West quote that many of you have heard me say before, that intimacy and tenderness, that is what love looks like in private. But justice is actually what love looks like in public, having a just world. That's what putting love at the center really means. And to me, that's also deeply connected for what you've heard me say before about the Universalist half of our Unitarian Universalist heritage. That when I kind of see, what does that universalism, that universal love, what does that look like in these iterations over time? Very, very briefly, there's so much to say about this, that in the 17th century, when universalism really got started, it looked like universal salvation for everyone. It looked like saying, we reject this idea that some God is going to damn people to hell forever, right? It looked like, universal love for all. But then that same sort of universalism in the 18th century looked like universal freedom from enslavement. That's how that universal love showed up, was abolitionism. It became increasingly to look less like rejecting hell in a next world and more like loving the hell out of this world. So that meant abolitionism in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it meant, working for, universal voting rights, first for women, then in the civil rights movement. Then it looked like, love wins in marriage equality in the late 20th century. And that to me looks like, and this doesn't have to be your politics, but this to me is the clear extrapolation of that, is that to do in our day what our Universalist ancestors, the big hard things they did in their day, it would look like working for universal health care for all. It would look like working for universal child care for all. Universal access to education, not just through high school, but all the way through college or vocational training. It would look like a universal basic income for all. And quite a few other universals that I would add to that. But I do think that is the work of our time that continues to extrapolate the work of our ancestors, of what love at the center and loving the hell out of this world, loving the hell out of the hellish things that we're currently doing to each other in a very systemic way. So as you continue your journey into the rest of today and into the week to come, continue your journey with love. That's not a small thing. Continue your journey with love at the center. Care for one another. Care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of even just a little more love or peace or joy or hope, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. And even in this hard time, continue to look for and savor all that still remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.